You're listening to Travel Tales with Fergal.
Hello, my name is Fergal O'Keefe and you're very welcome to the podcast. I walked the Camino de Santiago for this special three-part Camino podcast series this year, where I interviewed many interesting people including fellow walkers, pilgrims, guides and historians. The Camino is over 800 kilometres from the Spanish border in the Pyrenees to Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, and it typically takes a walker between 30 and 35 days to complete. In part 2 today, I talked to Catharine Murphy, the journalist, who has walked the Camino many times, and she gives us a great guide to the many ways to do the Camino. We then hear from some guides on the Camino, and then we finish off with a fascinating interview with the American writer Curtis Williams on the history of the Camino. The Camino is a truly magical pilgrimage, and I hope these 3 episodes convey in some small way why the Camino is so special to so many people around the world. We will have the final third part of this special series next Tuesday. Now, my first interview with Catharine Murphy. How many times have you actually been on the Camino? You've been on loads, haven't you?
I think I did my first one in 2005. I think I've done maybe 5 or 6 different bits and pieces here and there. So the first one was the French way, the Camino Frances, and we got as far as Los Arcos, traveling from France. And then I went on to Burgos. So my next section should be La Masetta on the French way. And then I've done a section of the Northern way. So that was Santander so it was from Cantabria into Asturias. I've done the Finisterre way, which is one of the only ones that takes you from Santiago out to Finisterre, or I actually ended up in Masetta, and that's the coast of death, as the pagans used to call it. They thought the sun died along that coast, the end of the world, Finisterre, and I loved that coastal sections. I've done part of the Portuguese way, but actually we started it in Spain, Bayona in Spain. And again, that brings you 100 kilometres into Santiago de Compostela, so you can get your credential, your Compostela at the end, say you've done your 100 kilometres. And I've done something else, can't remember now that you ask me.
The sailing one.
Oh, the sailing last year, yeah. I'm not a sailor, I don't sail, but someone said to me, oh, you can now sail the Camino. And I thought, well, I'm a big Camino fan, I love the Camino. And I thought, yeah, I instantly wanted to do that. And so basically, again, I joined, so it's a company called Sail the Way in Spain, and they do this rally every June, kind of late June. And so they sail across northern Spain, and I met them I started off in Masetta. So we sailed around Cap de Finisterre, which is very special, having walked that area. And yeah, we kind of sailed for 3 or 4 days, the part I did. And I loved it. It was great camaraderie. It's a great social side to it, Fergal, because obviously you do your sailing every day and you meet up in the next marina and met some fantastic people. I remember, so the way it worked was you sailed for your trip, and then you do your last 25 kilometres walking to get your Compostela. So we walked from Padrón into Santiago de Compostela, and I walked with like the ex-manager of Carlos Núñez, the famous Galician piper. I just met great people along the way, it's brilliant. And as I say, not a sailor, would be nearly inspired to try sailing after having done it.
Was there
really good.
Was there a bunch of boats then, you're saying? So the boats would all go into each harbour?
Yeah, it's a rally. So it's kind of, I suppose it's aimed at people who have their own boats. If you just happen to have a 49er yacht, in the back. But you could also, what's the word? You can rent. You can also, that's not the word, you could charter a boat from various companies in Bilbao or up around the area where we were in Galicia. That's also possible to do. And the company anyway sailed away, and they are running it again next June. And they're very keen to get some Irish people doing it. It's great fun, sleeping on the boat, 6 berth. And very cozy. We had 1 or 2 stormy nights. That's lovely, kind of cozy up in your berth. And but now it is Atlantic sailing. It's not like I made a total mistake. I turned up a suitcase full of,
shorts.
Yeah, basically, frothy little numbers, and they never got worn at all. It's the Atlantic, so it could be quite technical sailing. Like one day we were taken off the boat because it was just too rough. So we went and did our sightseeing that day. So, but then Galicia has a system of rias, so that's more gentle sailing. So that's more suitable for less advanced sailors. So really interesting. And anyone who's interested should have a look at sailtheway.es, I think it is. Just looking at it here. And also sailing boats, usually symbolic in the Camino, Fergal, because legend has it that St. James's remains were taken by boat by two of his disciples. To Padron, I think it was. So that legend is there. And also for Irish people who wanted to do the pilgrimage back in medieval times, they had to get there by sailing from Ireland. St. Brendan is meant to have done the voyage to do it. And also, as you know, there's a great documentary, Camino Voyage, which was Glenn Hansard and I think it was Danny Sheehy, the poet, the late poet Danny Sheehy, who undertook that voyage. That's a really great documentary to watch as well. So yeah, lots of symbolism associated with sailing the Camino.
And so you've walked it in loads of directions, and you've done the sailing, and you've also done a bit of horse riding as well then.
Well, now I was just writing about that, and as you know, we had a lovely gentle horse ride, didn't we, in the vineyards of Rioja, and I was, of course, trotting along saying, well, this is lovely, this is wonderful, and the next thing, I think both our horses bolted, did they? Or mine definitely did. Yeah. I was left hanging on for dear life. And I was just thinking the other day, I'm known as someone who loves my wine. It would have been deeply ironic if I had died trodden to death on a horse in a La Rioja vineyard. But anyway, it would have been quite fitting. But I was literally holding on to the reins for dear life. I thought, God, just managed to somehow. I think our guide stopped the horse, didn't she? And they calmed down, and I managed to. And we were
going towards a ridge, and that was a good 20, 30 feet drop.
I'll never forget it. I mean, it was just, we'd been discussing the fact that it was such a lovely thing to do. It was so gentle. It was completely gentle. And the horses were so completely in line with each other in a step, following literally every step of the guide, the way the guide went. And I said to the guide, what happened? And she said, maybe the horse saw a ghost. I said, maybe the horse knew she had an atheist on its back. I don't know. But something like that. But anyway, it's a bit tricky. But yeah, so at this stage I've walked, done a little bit of horse riding, sailing, and done a few sections by car as well.
Yeah, true. Yeah. And we skipped the cycling. They told them there was mention of cycling, but yeah. Well,
they wanted us to cycle that 10-kilometer uphill route, didn't they? Up to
the
actually went to Galicia, which is it was a fabulous section of the way, wasn't it?
And a gorgeous walk.
Beautiful walk. I mean, I was just reading, the guidebook, the medieval guidebook, they talked about the Codex Calixtinus, I think. I actually bought a copy of it in Santiago afterwards and read it. Very funny. Really informative if you had a horse and you needed to know which rivers were clean in the 12th century. That's basically what it was about. But I think the book talked about how Charlemagne got down on his bended knee on arriving into Galicia and gave thanks for the green and pleasant land. And that's how we all felt, I think, that day. It's a beautiful green mountainous area, but that hike up to Osabrera was a tough uphill hike. No way I would have done it on a bike. We did see people do it on bikes, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. But you know what? That's what for me, what made the Camino so special is like each region are so completely different from each other. Particularly there, you're going from the Masetta, the kind of the arid lands, and then you're going up over the mountains, and you're riding this green land, like the green Spain they call it, isn't it?
Yeah, Galicia, green, slow Spain. I mean, for me, and I think you've said in some of your articles, you're just walking through this immense history of the making of Spain. I don't know whether you've seen that BBC4 documentary series, Blood and Gold, The Making of Spain.
Yeah.
And, that's what we did. We walked through like Navarra region, over the Pyrenees into Pamplona and the whole Navarra region. It's, ancient battlegrounds of kings of Navarre and Aragon, and the front line between the Muslims and Christian battles, all this amazing history, and the relics of the cathedrals and the cloisters. It's just incredible. And then, as you said, La Masetta, it's just one of the most contentious sections of the Camino because people find it difficult. It's kind of long stretches of empty road, isn't it? Not many trees, not much shelter if you're walking in summer. Wheat, I think, is the only crop that's grown there. So it's this kind of brown, shaded fields, which I loved. And people say they either find that section meditative or, absolutely head wrecking. And I think I would find it both. I'd like to go back and do some more of it. I loved it. And then, as you say, you leave that, you go through Castilla y Leon, the cities of Leon and Burgos, both very important cathedrals, and then you pass into Ponferrada, where we saw the great Knights Templar Castle.
Exactly.
I know that's your favorite subject. Suddenly you're in green Galicia. Yeah, beautiful.
And personally, then, for you, is there an area that stands out that you particularly love or that you'd recommend?
For me, one of the standouts on the French way that we did, Puente Lorena for me was an eye-opener. As we were traveling, we had a great guide, Francisco Contreras, who's a Camino author, and he just gave us this potted history of the Knights Templar, didn't he? And that town was founded by a Knights Templar. It's just, I loved all that history. I'd been through that village before, oblivious to the history. So this time it was a real eye-opener to get that, and I absolutely loved that. And I would have to say the Northern Way, that section I did in Cantabria. Cantabria has these beautiful medieval villages, Santillana del Mar, which is not by the Mar, but anyway, beautiful medieval. Another one, Comillas, which is by the sea and has some Gaudi architecture. I love that. I have an ex from Cantabria, so I love that whole area. But also walking from Cantabria into Asturias is absolutely beautiful. I walked as far as Llanes, which is a seaside village, passing a little cove called Buelna, which I still think about years later. I think it's 6 or 7 years since I did that section. And I still often think about that little cove. And just Asturias is beautiful, has great food, reasonably priced food, and these just dotted with all these little seaside villages. And I absolutely loved it. And I'd love to go back to do earlier sections of the Northern Way, which are meant to be absolutely stunning. And I'd also like to do the Primitivo, which is one of the oldest Caminos. And it's a tougher, more hilly walk. And I like my hill walk, so I'd like to go back and do that. But yeah, they'd be my favorite sections. The parts of the Northern Way, and definitely Puente Lorena I loved. And of course, Santiago de Compostela I adored.
And would I be right in saying for food that it's Galicia that wins for you?
I'm a big seafood fan. I have to say, the Galician seafood, for example, pulpo, that dish of octopus, it's I think usually served with round pieces of potato and some pimiento on top. And people always say, well, if you don't, you can only have that dish in Galicia. You shouldn't really have that dish anywhere else. Personally, for me, the best and most affordable seafood I had was on the Portuguese way. Every day I stopped and had a plate of scallops for a tenner, or a plate of gambas al pilpil for a tenner. It was just readily available. It was affordable for me, and I loved it. I ate so much of the stuff. And Santiago, obviously, great for, what's that main street? I think it's Via Franco, possibly, not quite sure. But it's just restaurant, tapas bar. You just go in and have your glass of wine, a few tapas, and it's, I love it. I absolutely love the food, yeah.
And it's also buzzing because you have all these pilgrims coming in each day that gives the place an energy, doesn't it?
Yeah, as we watch them, when you arrive into that main square in front of the cathedral, they call it 0 kilometer on the French way. And as we saw groups of young Spanish pilgrims singing and celebrating, just full of joy that they had completed their Camino. And it's a great buzz around. Yeah, I love sitting around the squares in Santiago de Compostela, just sitting. There's usually a bit of music on the streets, and just sit and take it all in, soak it all up. And but there's such amazing things to do in Santiago. They're like nighttime tour of the cathedral, rooftop tour of the cathedral, which I love. I've done that about 3 times now. I love it. And there's just so many different things to see and do, but I just love wandering.
Exactly.
Wandering the streets, watching the people, and soaking up the history, the culture.
And my last question then is just, it's very special. The word I've noticed actually, the word I keep using is magical about the Camino. Like, what makes it so special or magical?
I've walked it both ways. You'd have the purists who say it only counts if you walk with your luggage. People who get their luggage, you can have your luggage transferred from hotel, town to town, and that's not really doing the Camino. I've done it both ways. I've carried my bags and slept in the €5 a night albergues, and I've done it the other way, staying in 4-star hotels. And I enjoy both, Fergal.
Yeah.
But I think for me, I've always said I love Spain. I love hiking. I love being on the open road. I love that freedom of just every day, just walk, eat, sleep, meet people, do it again the next day. It's complete freedom from your normal life. As you said, your mobile phone gets switched off. But for me, the Camino is a sum of its parts. You know, if people say, why would you enjoy sleeping in hostels and dormitories with people snoring? And well, you know, it's an experience. And
Exactly.
but it's the sum of its parts. It's not. It can be a religious pilgrimage if you want it to be. It can be a healing, transformative pilgrimage, which is what I wrote in my piece for the Sunday Independent. But it can also be this trip through just this immense and fascinating history of this incredible. Spain is just such an incredible country. Or it can just be about getting together for a holiday with a small group of friends. Keep your group small, and just being on the road and having fun, having good food. It's just an experience.
Yeah.
Well, and yeah, as you said, magical. What did you take from it?
Yeah, do you know what that exactly? You've summed it up actually perfectly, because that's what I got from it. That what I think about makes it so special is that people go to it. Maybe they're more open than normal because they've probably read a bit about it beforehand, and they're nearly being told that you're going to make friends with people. So they're more open than normal, I would say, to be open and to tell their stories, because especially if they watch, say, the movie The Way, they realize if they want to experience it like that, they're going to have to contribute. So that's my guess, that maybe people are more open to being open when they go on it.
Definitely.
But also, you know, it's kind of natural. It happens naturally. But as each day you go, you're talking to people who are telling you about how special it is and about how open people are. So that reinforces it, and it makes it acceptable. So it's the beauty of the walking, the history, and also the people who are open, who are sharing their stories. All those things make, because, you know, I've done loads of walking where it's just walking in nature, or it's just history, or just people, but this combines it all. I think that's what makes it so special.
Everyone's going through their own experience, I think. And I would say, if people are thinking about doing it for the first time, obviously 2022 is an extended Holy Year, so it's going to be a very busy year. So pick your moment, especially if you want to do certain sections. That section from Sarria into Santiago was very popular for first timers because it allows you to do 100 kilometers and get your Compostela. That will be busy. So try to book for a spring, or I think autumn we were talking about. But also, if you're going with a group of friends, what we found the first time we did it, we had an agreement that you walked at your own pace. That's very important. And meet up at the end of the day, because the Camino can bring out the best in people. It can also bring out, let's not say the worst in people, it can bring out different aspects of people. So we had a rule that you kind of agree to walk at your own pace, you know, so that you wouldn't be bickering about, well, you're going too fast, or you left me behind in this village, and where, you know, that can happen. And people can get quite competitive as well. So I would say keep your group small. Have an agreement that you walk at your own pace and meet up in the next village and have your drinks and dinner together, and book into the albergues together, and just have lots of fun and mix it up. Stay some nights in an albergue, stay some nights in small hotels. We often do that, 20 euros a night each. And treat yourself if you feel like it's, to a 4-star hotel. We stayed in a great 4-star in Pamplona, didn't we? Which is an old convent. And I mean, I loved that. I'm not, you know, I'm no spring chicken anymore. So I love the fact that you can have a little bit of a treat and a bit of luxury at your own bed in your own bedroom.
And even, you know, a tip I would give to people, like something we did is we had lunch in a Parador. So you mightn't stay in the Parador, but you could go in there for lunch and experience the atmosphere of the place and get a gorgeous lunch. Or even in Roncesvalles, is that place where the first place we stayed in was next door to the Albergue, you know, and that was it was very cheap, but it was a lovely hotel. You know?
We had lunch that day. That was the Parador in Santo Domingo del Calzado. Again, I mean, you asked me about highlights of the French way. It's an absolute, it is a jewel in the crown. It's a beautiful little village, beautiful, and the cathedral or the monastery, just stunning, and the history, absolutely stunning. And of course, the legend of the pilgrim. We won't tell people. We leave them to find that out for themselves. The chicken coop. That was that part. And the other thing we did was we had, I think, the Parador in Santiago. I've stayed it once. It's absolutely beautiful historic building. It's steeped in the history. An old pilgrims hospital, obviously built by an old Spanish king in the Middle Ages. I think we've been told that's booked up next year now. I'm sure people will manage to get bookings along the way. But when we arrived, we went and had tea and cake on the terrace, didn't we? So that's one way of experiencing and just learning a bit of that. And I think it's really a good idea as well in Santiago to have a guided tour. There's so much history in the place, and not just Camino history and religious history. There's so much cultural history there. It's incredible. So
exactly. And actually that'd be a good tip too, is if you could get guides in other towns as well, because we went into churches and got the history of the place, and you could see it. Pilgrims are just walking by with their head down and they don't realize the history. And I think that really adds to the whole experience of the Camino.
Absolutely. As I said to you, back in 2005, I walked with friends. I mean, we may have gone into one or two churches along the way, but we were largely oblivious. Our whole focus was on the walking. And, you know, some of the friends were walking 25, 30 kilometers a day. It was maybe the first time they had done it. So you are very focused on being able to do the walking part of it. It's not without its challenges. For first-time people doing it. So definitely there were all sorts of, you know, sore legs and aching joints and blisters, foot blisters and stuff. So we're definitely very focused on that. But yeah, for me this time around, to have seen all the cultural highlights and the different cathedrals and the different eras and all the Romanesque religious art, and yeah, absolutely incredible. Absolutely loved it. And I think it makes it a much more rounded experience.
Yeah.
You come away with a lot more, I think. So I definitely recommend. And I think in Santiago de Compostela, there are free guided tours certain times each day. And like the rooftop tour of the cathedral, it's so cheap. It's about €12 per person. You know, it's very affordable, and it's a really nice thing to do. So
because you get to see the whole city. It's not just the church. You see the whole city.
You get that overview of the city, which is absolutely beautiful. Yeah. So definitely for me, and I'm not religious. I think I've told you this before, but I would view that religious history as a big, massive chunk of fascinating history. And so it's not just religious. And I think they're really telling people these days, the Camino can be anything you want it to be. It's not only a religious pilgrimage. Not that I want to take away from people who are doing it for that reason, because it's a very important aspect of it, isn't it? And very important for people who want to make the journey for that reasons for doing it.
Yeah, and that's another thing I liked about the Camino, that maybe in normal life there isn't as much as that. If someone's religious, you can talk to them about it, or you can be together with a person in a church, and I'm getting the history of the church and they might be getting the religious side of it. But again, that open part where you're both understanding of each other's perspective. I like that.
Yeah, you've just reminded me, actually, because when I was there in June, sailing with Sail the Way, we finished up in Santiago. We had a great day in Santiago. We went to Mass. We went to the Pilgrims Mass in the cathedral that evening. And one of the women who was on the trip, who I hadn't really spoken to before, she started to tell me a very moving story that her mother, she was there with her sister, and their mother had passed away, and they were doing the pilgrimage, making the pilgrimage in honor of their mother. But I didn't know the woman at all, really. And she started to tell me this story, and we had a good chat, and we exchanged phone numbers afterwards, and kept in touch a little bit. So yeah, that openness is a big part of it, definitely. And over the years, I've definitely met people who've maybe had a relationship end, and they're trying to find their feet again, or trying to get their confidence back. Or I think a lot of during the recession, going back to 2008, 2010, and afterwards, a lot of people lost their jobs and just said, here, I'm off. And a lot of people, I mean, you meet people who've done 2,000 kilometer, journeys. I've met people who've walked from Geneva, so people do it for all sorts of reasons. And it is a great, freeing of the mind to get on the open road. And, I think what I often write these days is that there's this vast network of Caminos. You can spend your life doing the Camino. People now live on the Camino, don't they? They volunteer in refugios and stuff. Or you find people who just don't want to stop. So they get to Santiago de Compostela and say, oh, I don't want to stop. So they then do the walk out to Finisterre. And then you'll find that they do the walk back from Finisterre. And, there's this incredible, there's a great map that we saw. And there's just an incredible network of Caminos that are all joining up. And of course, you then have the link to the Via Francigena. And, it's a separate thing, but they're all linked. So there's this amazing European network of Caminos and different long distance routes you can do.
And so now I'm noticing, say, I went to Porto a few weeks after and met our lovely guide Helder, who was with us in Castile y Leon. And I was going around, but, you could see the Camino shells and the yellow markings in Porto, so you start to notice them. probably can see them in Dublin if you looked as well.
Yeah, well, again, where I spend a lot of time in Catalonia, in Spain, and there's a Catalan Camino, which I haven't done yet. And one of the local towns I go to, Balaguer, I often see the flèches of the arrows, as they call them. And I think that was one of the things we learned on our trip from our guide, Francisco, that to really appreciate the history and the culture of the Camino, occasionally the yellow arrows are great. They help you to not get lost, but occasionally you should ignore them a little bit and step off the way to see some of the very interesting churches and monasteries and other cultural buildings along the way. And to have a full experience.
Exactly. And I'm actually going to play a clip on the podcast here of Francisco talking about Uneste, that church, that Templar church. And that was off the beaten track. And that was one of the most memorable things that we did on the whole tour, you know.
It was the beginning of the first hint we got of the Knights Templar history, wasn't it? And,
exactly.
The hint of what was to come. And a fascinating, very serene, beautiful place, as I recall. And absolutely fascinating.
As Catherine mentioned there, having guides really help to bring the history, and they offer explanations of the symbolism of the Camino and they bring it to life. We were really lucky to have Francisco Contreras, who is a Camino legend, and he's written a best-selling guide to the Camino. Francisco and the other guide, Ursula, brought us to a church at a crossroads of the Aragon and French ways of the Camino. This church, like so many places in the Camino, it was full of history and myth and symbolism, including unofficially being linked to the Templar Knights, a topic that I love. I want you to get a feeling of how passionate people are about the history and myths of the Camino. You're going to hear now a short clip of a discussion between our guides Ursula and Francisco and a local historian at a church called Unate, which has a magical quality about it that you only find on the Camino, that combines history, religion, mysticism and myth. So it's just a short clip now.
But for him it's special, this place is quite special, and I wanted to, because I know him and he has told me that this for him has a special meaning, because he spent the night here. Because he just get here, it used to be a hostel there, that house where we stand used to be a hostel, but when he arrived 16 years ago, that was closed, and he arrived at 9, and so suddenly he found this open, nobody there. He was working with another 3 ladies, and they spent the night here. Imagine, no benches, 16 years ago, no lights. So he feels as a pilgrim of the medieval time. It was his first walk, Camino. Yes, he says after 16 years he's gonna be here in the same place with some Irish journalists. And it's important to know there are different books, different visions here. Sometimes there are people coming here doing some rituals, but we have documents about Templar and Encomienda Templaria in just close to here, no, just in Puente la Reina. Te estoy diciendo. Fran says there was a time that the Templars were kick out. Yes, they kick out. That's what I'm saying. Yes. So the documents might be destroyed. That was, we don't find. They said that document they were persecuted one time at once. So that's why nowadays we don't find those documents, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. But for the archaeology people, the people that study documents, you know, books, or where is it written, where is the says, okay, it has this vision. So the important thing here is the importance of these chairs, and the importance is unique. It's unique, and probably these discussions, or these not discussions, I mean these different views. No, yeah, these different views. Estoy explicando, yeah. So probably this is the importance of this church.
This place creates a passion.
Yes, create a passion. One passion, another passion. But this is something for everybody who visit this.
No, es la cara de la sábana santa.
de la Sábana Santa.
La cabeza de un carnero.
Un carnero, ¿no? Sí, eso yo sabía, del cordero.
No, they're still at it. They're driving the train.
Otra vez.
So you do you know what? It's always good to see, like, just say, it's always good to know myths as well as factual, because you learn a lot.
Yes.
You should always. There's nothing wrong with talking about.
No, that's
because
why
there's always truth in
for
myths.
me, it's quite interesting knowing them. For me, I'm learning more and more, and having this is quite interesting for me. Being a curious people, simple curious, it's quite interesting.
This is the magic of the way. It's different. Este lugar es diferente. Sea templario o sea del Santo Sepulcro, his energy is el lugar, the mountains, in the cruce de caminos, Roncesvalles, Leire, Aragón, Leire, is different. It's very special. For me, it's very special.
My last interview today now is with American Curtis Williams, who has written many articles on the Camino for the Catholic Herald. Curtis tells us now all about the history of the Camino. Curtis, you're very welcome to the podcast. I read a brilliant article of yours in the Catholic Herald, sort of summed up perfectly the history of the Camino and how it came about and how it grew again in the 20th century. So I just wanted to ask you about that. So you started off, I mean, for people who are listening to this podcast who don't know about the history, they know about the Camino, but I mean, Santiago, St. James, the Compostela is the star. So St. James of the Stars, like how did it come about, this Camino?
Well, the actual pilgrimage was born following the rediscovery of St. James's tomb in the early 9th century. And the tradition that comes down to us is that obviously that James and some companions, after Christ ascended into heaven and he sent the apostles out to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth, there is a very old tradition that says that the apostles divided up the known world at the time, most of which was covered, the Mediterranean part of which was covered by the Roman Empire, and that they came here to Hispania, James and several other companions, and that he preached here, didn't have much success, ended up going back to Jerusalem, and that's where he was beheaded by King Herod, the grandson of the one in the Christmas story. And then his disciples took his body and sailed back to Spain and buried him in the northwest corner of Spain, one of the areas where he had labored according to the tradition. And then the tomb was lost, with the passage of time and the end of Roman power in the peninsula. The tomb was lost. And so in the early 19th century, there was a Christian hermit living in the area, who had an apparition one night, the sound of angels singing and a star shining brightly on top of a little hill near where he was living. And he went up and he discovered the tomb, and he called the bishop of Iria Flavia, which was the nearest city, who came out, Theodomir came out, Bishop Theodomir came out, discovered the tomb, sent word to the king in Asturias, King Alfonso. And so the first pilgrimage route was literally the king traveling from Asturias, which was the only part of Spain which had remained free of Moorish control, traveling from the city of Oviedo in Asturias down to this woodland area, this rural area near Iria Flavia, where the tomb had been discovered. And they confirmed the discovery of the tomb according to the tradition, the identity of the occupants, and that set things in motion.
And then it grew. So from the 9th century on, over medieval times, the popularity of the trail grew. Yeah,
it obviously we don't have lots of well-detailed records of the earliest pilgrimages, and almost certainly it was a local pilgrimage initially. Okay, so it would have been that corner, and from Asturias and from Galicia and things like that. But word of the rediscovery went to the Pope in Rome, obviously, and it spread throughout Europe. And the earliest recorded, unless there's been some research that I'm unaware of, the earliest recorded pilgrimage from outside of Spain is Bishop Gottiscalc in around the year 950. Okay, he traveled with a large group of pilgrims. He was from Le Puy, if I'm remembering correctly. Well, he was from Aquitaine. No, excuse me, he was from Aquitaine. Anyway, he traveled there with a large retinue of pilgrims and servants. And that's the earliest one that we have, like, really clear recorded. So by the middle of the 10th century, within a century, it was obviously drawing pilgrims from all over Europe. Yeah.
And then in the 12th century, the French route opened up as the Moors moved down. Or
the Camino was very important in the history of the Christian kingdoms in the north of Spain, particularly like the Kingdom of Navarre, which is where I live here in Pamplona, because it kept these tiny Christian kingdoms which were struggling for their survival against the more powerful and wealthier Moorish kingdoms to the south of the peninsula. It kept them in contact with the Christian countries of the north, the Christian kingdoms of the north. And the kings, seeing the pilgrim flow and the pilgrim traffic, they soon realized the advantages that the Camino brought economically, also for repopulating towns that had been reconquered from the Moors, and they needed to attract populations, so they would offer privileges and rights to anyone willing to come and settle in these towns in order to sort of solidify their frontiers, etc. So while the earliest pilgrims may very well have struggled along the northern coast of Spain in the 9th century, and again, we don't have a lot of really clear records of that, but we do have traces of those pilgrims in all the places along the north of Spain. By the 10th century, the French route had become the main route. You know, pilgrims would cross either at Roncesvalles, which, you know, is in the southwest of France, northwest of Spain. Well, not northwest of Spain, but where Spain connects to France. And also over there further east, they would cross over in the Kingdom of Aragon at the Somport Pass. And then the two routes would join in Puente la Reina. That became the route really by the middle of the 10th century, the main route. Okay, well, especially because it was easier. It was much easier.
And a line that really stood out in your article was, you said, the allure and popularity of the pilgrimage to Compostela throughout medieval Europe is difficult to overstate, as the influence it had on forging a common European identity. So it wasn't just important in Spain, but throughout medieval Europe, this pilgrimage.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it's hard to imagine Europe in the Middle Ages for a lot of people, but European identity wasn't based. I mean, we're used to the nation states and that sort of thing, and I'm Spanish, I'm French, I'm English, I'm whatever. But the common identity that Europe had in that period of medieval history was Christendom. Okay, it was united with a common faith. There still hadn't been the Western schism that separated the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. There still hadn't been the Protestant Reformation that separated the Western Church into Protestant and Catholic. So there was a common Christian identity amongst all of these kingdoms. Obviously, in the 10th century, not every corner of Europe had yet been fully Christianized. But the Camino did contribute to maintaining that common identity, because, well, for example, the route across the north of Spain is called the French route, just because of the vast number of French pilgrims that poured across on their way to Santiago de Compostela. But all the way up in Germany, in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in Poland, there are all places associated with the pilgrim's route to Santiago de Compostela. Because it was the third most important site in Christendom. And for Northern European pilgrims and pilgrims from the center of Europe, it was easier to get to than the other two being Jerusalem and Rome. Jerusalem was just too far away. You had to be very wealthy to get there, and it was very dangerous because of the occupation of certain areas, especially the Holy Land, by the Arabs, by the Muslims. And Rome was obviously appealing because that's where St. Peter and St. Paul were buried. But you had that little obstacle called the Alps, and that was quite a formidable obstacle for a lot of people. A lot of pilgrims obviously did go, but Santiago de Compostela became the option for a lot of people from the north of Europe and from the center of Europe. It was an apostolic tomb too, so it had sort of any shrine that had connection with Jesus, be it like Jerusalem because that's where he lived and died, or Rome because of Peter and Paul or any apostle connected with him. Those were the most important shrines for medieval Christians.
And then through medieval times and into the 15th, 16th century, the numbers were growing. But then the numbers, I presume with the Reformation and Protestantism, etc., that the numbers start to reduce. So by the 18th century, the numbers, as you say, were down to a trickle, the number of pilgrims.
Yeah. I mean, the Protestant Reformation and then the wars of religion that followed it, I should say, that obviously had a tremendous impact. Now, in the northern countries, which many of which went over to the Protestant faith, obviously they took a very dim view of devotion to saints and a very dim view of things like relics and those things, writing them off as superstition and idolatry. And Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and these fellows were especially severe with their followers about the uselessness and the sinfulness of such practices. Okay, so that pretty much cut off a lot of the pilgrim traffic from those Protestant countries in the north of Europe. No good Protestant in the 18th century would be caught making a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela.
In 1972, only 72 pilgrims, official pilgrims, made the route, which is quite amazing, considering now what we're at. I mean, like in 2019, it was 350,000 pilgrims that made the official pilgrimage, and lots more that did bits, pieces of it. So that was 1972, 72 to 2019. We get 350,000 pre-pandemic times. So what happened in between then? Because it just exploded from the 80s.
In the 60s and 70s, I mean, it was pretty much the realm of academics and history buffs. And certainly along the route that people walk today, there was memory. The towns in Spain preserved memory of the Camino, and the few pilgrims that would come through, I mean, it's like they still were recognized as pilgrims, and the red carpet was rolled out for them. But it was mainly academics and medieval historians and scholars, that sort of thing, that were doing it. And then sort of you had this convergence of events in starting in the very late 70s, early 80s. I think probably one of the first ones was when Pope John Paul II decided to go to Santiago de Compostela, and he actually went there twice. One was in 1982, which was a holy year in Santiago de Compostela. Okay, and that year, the numbers had been growing. Okay, there were about 1,800 or 1,900 pilgrims that year who got their Compostelas in the cathedral office. So still a very minuscule number compared. But then Pope John Paul's apostolic visit there sort of blew it open to the attention of the wider world. And then a few years later, because he made a very sort of impassioned speech there, pleading with Europe to remember its roots, to recover its Christian identity and remember its roots. Okay. And then a couple of years later, sort of in 1985, the United Nations, the UNESCO World Heritage Organization, declared the city of Santiago de Compostela a World Heritage Site. Okay, and that was sort of in the years when Spain was just starting to it was moving toward joining the European Union. So obviously there was a big push on the part of the Spanish government to get a lot of sites in Spain recognized and protected as World Heritage Sites, and Santiago was one of the early ones, and so that drew attention as well. And then in 1980, I think it was 1989, Pope John Paul II actually wound up coming back, and he came back. He had the first World Youth Day was held in Santiago de Compostela in 1989. And that just blew the doors off of it, because all of a sudden you had all these young people hiking along at least the last sort of stretch of the Camino and in Santiago to see Pope John Paul II. And after that, it was just sort of no stopping it. And the Galician government invested a lot of money to prepare for the papal visit. The Galician government sort of, when they saw the potential that Santiago had, thanks to that papal visit, the next Holy Year was going to be 1993, and they poured an enormous amount of money, with help from the European Union, into developing an infrastructure in Galicia of free albergues. That just said everything, that put the seal on everything. Really, that was the first big boom year. That was the big turning point in the numbers walking the road, was sort of that Holy Year of 1993. And after that, it's just been on the increase ever since.
So could you have imagined, doing your first Camino back in the early 90s to now, the growth of it?
No. And it's a completely different experience now. It's a completely different experience. And I suppose a lot of people moan about how different and how much it's changed, but there's no point. I mean, there's no way for it to be the experience that it was in the 1990s. Not only because of the numbers, but just because of technology. I mean, when I first came, there were no even mobile phones to be had on the Camino. There was no internet. And so when those things were developed, it was only normal that the pilgrims were going to use them in order to navigate along the Camino. As well as it's been a huge boon. There's areas that you pass through now on the Camino that when I came through the first time, they were dead. They were abandoned villages. And now the Camino has brought life back to those villages. And then I'm thinking, especially in the Bierzo region of the Camino, between sort of Astorga and Ponferrada. There's villages there like Santa Catalina de Somoza and Rabanal del Camino and El Acebo, and other little villages after you leave Astorga that they were just very poor and filled with dilapidated, abandoned houses, and maybe, a dozen old folks still living there because that's where they'd lived all their lives. But now, they're filled with bars and restaurants and albergues and bed and breakfast hotels, and that's a blessing for the people that are there. They can make a living, So I'm not of the opinion that it's all bad now, that the commercialization of the Camino is just a bad thing. People have a right to make a living, and a need, not just a right. They have a need to make a living. So
exactly. Well, thank you so much, Curtis, for that, for the history for people. I think people will be very interested in that. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking me to talk to you. I enjoyed meeting you when you were here, and I look forward to seeing you back on the Camino at some point.
Exactly. I hope you enjoyed those interviews today as much as I did. I have my final Camino episode next Tuesday, when I will share interviews with people I met along the pilgrimage, and I asked all of them one simple question: why is the Camino so magical? I really look forward to sharing those answers with you next week. Take care. Bye.
You're listening to Travel Tales with Fergal.